Hello. I know I didn't announce it again. Um, I won't let it become a habit. Don't scream at me. But I wanted to follow up because some people asked me yesterday, both on YouTube, because this is on YouTube, and also here to explain, well, why don't you use outer planets as rulers? So I decided that I would talk a little bit about using outer planets or why I don't use outer planets as rulers. Before I start, I want to say that this is instantly controversial. It's controversial because it becomes a matter of belief and sometimes adamant belief whether someone uses outer planets, i.e., Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, as rulers. That doesn't mean it's wrong. Um, I will explain more so why I don't do it. When I say it doesn't mean it's wrong, it probably might be better for me to say, or more accurate for me to say, I'm not trying to convince anyone I'm right. I'm going to give my reasons for why I do what I do, which is distinct. Which also means on some level I'm not as interested in debating about it because I spent many years doing that. What I am interested in doing is anyone who has intelligent questions about the reason why I do what I do, this is why I would be fine with answering those questions. But debating it, I've done it with many astrologers over many years, and I've been doing this for over 30 years, and it's just not as interesting to me. So let me explain a little why I don't use outer planets as rulers. And just to be clear, the outer planets are usually ascribed the following signs. Uranus is given to Aquarius, Neptune is given to Pisces, and Pluto is given to Scorpio. So when I first learned astrology, this is what I learned. That Uranus was the ruler of Aquarius, that Neptune was the ruler of Pisces, and Pluto was the ruler of Scorpio. I had questions because then we also have co-rulers, or we also have the outer planets as co-rulers, whereas traditionally Saturn is the ruler of Aquarius, Jupiter is the ruler of Pisces, and Mars is the ruler of Scorpio. So I was like, well, how did that come to be? So let me share first what I thought was the case. What I thought was the case in terms of planets ruling particular signs is I thought that astrologers over thousands of years, and most recently with the discovery of the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, in that order, I thought astrologers basically got together and compared notes and said, well, look, Abukanaka, I see that Venus is in Taurus again. And by virtue of that, things seem to be better than when she was in Aries. Yes, Akano. I agree with you. I think Venus is the ruler of Taurus. And that is how it came to be, right? There's no record of that ever happening. It didn't happen. So this idea that, well, planets fare better and are rulers of particular signs is based on some kind of empiricism and observation where they seem to have behaved better. That didn't happen. So it's not on that level of empiricism where we understand that the inner planets or the 7 traditional planets had their rulership. So then when I discovered that, and I'll share something in a minute on what I really discovered that I think really better explains how we have the rulerships. Well, I said, surely the modern astrologers with the modern planets, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, they must have come together and said, well, I think Uranus does better in Aquarius, and Neptune, of course, Pisces. And then we must have Pluto for Scorpio. And that's what I was like, okay, then these astrologers got together, they had their conferences, and they wrote their papers. That didn't happen either. Like, well, what the hell happened? Well, let's go back. The big news is to understand that the planets are organized the way they are for particular signs by a schema. I don't mean a scheme, I mean a schema. Just like you have a schema for numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, A, B, C, D, all those particular things. You know, we know that D in the English alphabet is the fourth letter of the alphabet. But perhaps you never asked yourself the question like, why is D number 4? Okay. And there are reasons, right? Starting from using the Egyptian alphabet all the way to the Semitic alphabet to what we now know in terms of the Greek alphabet, and then now, you know, in terms of the Roman and Latin, we should say. And then it becomes more in English related to sounds. But what I'm showing you, and I'm going to hold it up here, and I know it's backwards for you, is something called the Thema Mundi, or the story of the world. And it is this idea that these are the planetary positions at the formation of the world. And roughly that they were all at 15 degrees. Now, this again, just to be clear, is mythological. It is not where someone recorded it, as we know, actually in the sky at these particular degrees. Now, I do know, there is an astrologer who I think has 6 out of the 7 planets in these positions. Her name is Isabel Hickey. She's no longer with us. She wrote a book, Astrology, the Cosmic Science. So I think that's really cool. But this is more a hypothetical chart. And you're like, okay, so what? What does this mean? Well, I'm pointing to here. This is Cancer. And it's not going in the order that you're used to, probably starting from Aries. It's starting from Cancer all the way through to Capricorn. Now, there are some replicas of the Thema Mundi that fill in the blanks here, up here, which will be the continuation of the same planets. But I take this as much more accurate because, one planet can't be in 2 places at once, literally. And again, this is not literal. So the natural question you may have, and I will unpack this and reveal my face and then I'll put it back up. Why did it start with Cancer? Why didn't it start with Aries? It started with Cancer for a couple reasons. First, let me say this. One thing that is pretty clear, what we call Western astrology might be better called Afro-Asiatic astrology. And it's because some measure its roots start in, or most of its roots start in what we call Asia, along the Tigris-Euphrates, with the various permutations of the Mesopotamian, Sumerian, and Babylonian cultures. The other part of it is in Africa. You mean we're in Africa? Is it in Nigeria? Is it in South Africa? It's in Egypt. And in case people forget, Egypt is in Africa. But it wasn't the Africans, it was the Europeans or the Greek people who were there and the Roman citizens, and they were white. Here's a problem with that idea. One, that's true. That there were, people we would consider now in our lexicon white. But the truth is, many of them, starting from Greek thought, drew much of their wisdom from Egypt, which again is in Africa. Now you're like, well, but we won't necessarily designate the Egyptians as Africans, black Africans. But I mean, you can just look at their reliefs and see that they're different permutations of people who look more like me than people who look like, Vikings. And I won't get too deep into the weeds with that, but I think that is very important to make, because in terms of drawing on that wisdom, what the Greeks and the Romans did is they drew in some of the ideas that the Egyptians had. For instance, the main river, the Nile, flows from the south, what we would consider the south, to the north, one of the few rivers, if not the only river, that does this in the world. That's important to know because then there's a certain different orientation. And what was classified as east with the rising sun was said to designate related to life. And what was classified on the west was more so where one was buried, and that related to death. So in terms of south, north, east, west, this is where we get our orientation. The other thing is that the Egyptians also venerated a star, which they called Sotet, which we also call now Sirius. So Sirius was said to be closer at the time that we have the arrival of Hellenistic thought, more so the heliacal rising of it in Cancer. This is kind of the basis, by the way, of what many people were talking about when they were talking about the Lion's Gate and the heliacal rising of Sirius, which, yeah, it does happen maybe close to the 8th of August in Egypt, but not probably where you live. I'm just telling you. It probably happened earlier or it's going to happen later. It happens in different parts of the world because of this thing we call latitude. Now, this goes to another key point. So with the arrival of this and then going along with the inundation of the Nile, roughly around that time, the Egyptians commemorated what they called their New Year, which happened again around the time that in June or close to it, when we have the rise of the scarab. Oops, I said the scarab, right? Because that was the original name of the crab that we know now as Cancer, Cancri in Latin. So we have the rise of Cancer, and so we have this idea that the new year really begins with the arrival of Cancer, as it was for the Egyptians. Hence, Cancer is given that particular point. The other thing is, so you might say, like, well, then that's the commencement related to summer. Yes, and you might remember in school that there's this thing called the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. And I remember asking my teacher, like, why is it called that? And she said, that's just the way it is. But why? I always got in trouble in school because I was like, well, why? Why? Also with my parents. Why? Anyway, so the Tropic of Cancer, the Tropic of Capricorn, is where we are tracing the northerly and southern points of the imaginary orbit of the sun around the Earth. So that reaches its apex toward Cancer, and then it reaches its nadir as we go toward Capricorn, which we talk about as the solstices. So the reason why we're starting with Cancer is more an homage and understanding related to Sirius, directly related to Egyptian culture. So the sun was said to rule all of the signs of the zodiac because the sun is the center of our universe. The sun is our life giver. The sun is the powerful one. But because the Egyptians, like most other cultures, including Babylonian, saw the luminaries as, together as king and queen of heaven, they decided, I think, something quite adept and adroit, to give Leo to the sun because it was hotter. We had the rise of summer, but it was hotter in the northern hemisphere. And for those who are asking, like, well, what about in the southern hemisphere where it's winter? No one was doing this form of astrology in the southern hemisphere at that particular point in human history. So it's not an issue. We can talk about that another time. And I know there's some people who are doing research. Natan Theo Nacker in South Africa and some other people in Australia who are really trying to figure out, like, well, does it shift? That's a different question. And that's more for research. But, so the sun is said to be hotter. So the sun was given domain over Leo and the moon was given domain over Cancer. Pretty simple. Now, the rest of it in terms of why the planets rule the signs they rule It's very simple, and it was mind-blowing when I learned this. It's by something we call Chaldean order. Some would argue that it's actually Egyptian. But the real thing to know, it's by speed. Once we have accounted for the fastest moving body in the heavens, which is the moon, and then we have the sun, the next is going to be Mercury. And so Mercury, since also Mercury can't be too far from the sun, was given dominion over Virgo. And then the next fastest body was given dominion or rulership over Libra. Then the next was Scorpio for Mars, or Mars for Scorpio. Then Jupiter, as the next slowest body, was given Sagittarius. And then Saturn was given Capricorn. Like, oh, so it's based on speed. Yep. It's the geometry of light and speed. That is literally the formation for this. But what about the top part, Sam? Okay. So this is Mercury again. Goes the same order. For Gemini. Then for Taurus, it's Venus again. Then for Aries, it's Mars again. Then for Pisces, it's Jupiter again. And then finally, rounding it all off, is Saturn. So Saturn is given domain over 2 signs. There's another deep aspect to this. So I don't like to engender the planets as much, or the signs. I'm getting away from that. So what I'll say is that the quote unquote masculine aspect, we could call them assertive. That's the sun in Leo. And then the feminine, or we could say receptive, is more Cancer. So this kind of idea parallels itself even in the outline of the planets, because then every planet, like Mercury, will have it be received in a receptive sign, like in Virgo, then an assertive one in Gemini, an assertive sign for Venus in an air sign, and then a receptive one in Taurus for Venus, and then a receptive sign for Mars, but then an assertive one in Aries for Mars, and then an assertive sign and a fire sign for Jupiter, and then a receptive one, a water one in Pisces, and then Saturn's in a receptive one for Capricorn, and then a assertive one in Aquarius. So I'm going to make sure I said that correctly. So this is receptive, this is assertive. That's the reason. And that's the reason why these planets have rulerships in these particular signs. It has nothing to do with affinity. A lot of people are like, well, Mars rules Aries because, it's dealing with the Aries energy, that energy of trying to get out and make things happen, blah. It's backwards. Aries has some of its significations because of Mars. And because Mars happens to be the ruler of Aries because of how it falls in that schema. So when I learned this, the rationality, the beauty of this, I was like, oh, well, that makes all the sense in the world. Okay, well, here comes the outers. Now, the outers do have a schema, or an attempt at a schema, but there's a couple shifts. Now, one thing to understand about the early 20th century and then the late 19th century is because more and more people were being exposed through the discoveries of astronomy to other planets. Like in the 19th century, there had been discovery of Neptune. In the 18th century, there was discovery of Uranus. So, people started asking astrologers, like, but you're not using the new planets, though. Like, y'all garbage. Because, you're, using old stuff. Coupled with that, encountering new ideas from the East, thanks to imperialism, Europeans, specifically the English, with their dominion over India and different parts of the East, started encountering these new ideas and wanted to incorporate them. And so the idea of, that humans are evolving and changing, also that's a Western idea, but changing in our consciousness, and we have different races of human beings, and not just races as black, white, and Asian, but races of human beings that go back. And this is like the ideas of Madame Blavatsky and the White Lodge, and also in terms of Alice Bailey and her esoteric astrology, and the Astrological Lodge of London, and then also in terms of CEO Carter and Alan Leo, they started piecing together these different ideas, that we can deal with higher ways of being and evolution. Now, I am mocking this, okay? If that offends you, okay, I understand. But I'm mocking it for a reason, which I can get into another time. Um, well, basically, I'll say, I don't think we've changed that much in thousands of years. I think, if anything, what the Middle East proves, we're pretty much the same. We're actually, I could argue we are better, but not on the scale of broad evolution. Now, you're like, what's this got to do with outer planets? Well, people started thinking well, we need to recognize as we're discovering these new planets that, these older planets, these 7 planets, resemble more of how we've been, more than how we are. So, or becoming. So what we see is that Uranus was given Aquarius, going away from the old Saturn, and Saturn ruling that. And then Neptune was given Pisces, and you see there's an order. Now here's the flipper. Many astrologers, not all of them, but many of them said, well, then Pluto rules Aries. Now, you might say, but didn't you say Pluto rules Scorpio? Well, there were some who felt like Pluto seemed to have more analogy or be analogous, parallel to Scorpio. Now remember, the original formation of the schema had nothing to do with parallels or this is, similar or similarities. Had nothing to do with it. But the modern astrologers said, well, then, Pluto seems more like Scorpio than Aries. Now, the original idea for the schema, going from Aquarius to Pisces to Aries and Taurus, is that we would discover new planets, and then that we would discover a new planet that would be the ruler of Taurus. And in fact, people believed that we had. Well, what planet was that? I haven't heard about it. You have. It was called Vulcan. You mean Spock's world? Yeah, but it wasn't. It wasn't attributed. It was before. What's the guy? Gene Roddenberry actually decided to incorporate the idea, the name Vulcan for Spock. So there was this belief that there was a planet between Mercury and the Sun. I don't know how that would be there, but that we would discover a planet between Mercury and the Sun, and it was Vulcan, and it was the proper ruler of Taurus. So here's the thing. Well, they didn't discover it, and then it kind of just stopped. People didn't keep going, around. So this idea that the outer planets first recognize a higher level of consciousness wasn't based on any level of empiricism, because it wasn't as if the astrologers again kind of went, oh, well, I think, Bob, that, we could see that Uranus does better in Aquarius. You're right. And, with Neptune and Pisces, though, I think that's what, that's probably what works. Here's the problem. One, at the time that the astrologers have been talking about the outers in these signs, they hadn't been in those signs in modern history to really have, close observation. You're like, what do you mean? Well, Pluto didn't go into Scorpio until the 80s, and Uranus didn't go into Aquarius until sometime in the early 20th century, or the late 20th century. And we just now, in terms of modern history, have Neptune into Pisces. So how do we know, it works better? There's another problem with that, philosophically. What's the other problem with it philosophically? The other problem philosophically is that when astrologers say to me, well, I know Pluto is the ruler of Scorpio because I have recognized and seen it work. And what they're saying is that I am applying the scientific method and I can see that this empirically works. Here's the problem with that if you really know the scientific method. Well, I'm the asshole who asked them, yeah, but did you check it when Pluto was in Taurus? I mean, it's been a long time since Pluto's in Taurus, so it's a kind of unfair thing. But how do you know it doesn't rule Capricorn? How have you ruled out that it doesn't rule Aquarius? How have you ruled out that it didn't rule Sagittarius? So you know that it empirically works for Scorpio before it even got to Scorpio, but we haven't checked the other 11 signs to know that it's rulership. And you're like, well, but it could be. Well, it's not because the original schema, as I said earlier, and I know maybe that was about 30 minutes ago, the original schema was not based on empiricism. It was based on a philosophy, a poetry, and a logic that was rational, related to speed. Nobody, again, Abukunaga, didn't look at Mars and go like, bitch, I think that's Aries. I think that Mars rules Aries. I think that's what's right. It didn't happen. It didn't happen to them. It didn't happen. So when I say to you, and I challenge, or I used to challenge, now I'm just giving you the logic. But when I would challenge astrologers and like, well, why don't you use, outer rulers? These are the fallacies I came upon, especially when you learn the history. You might say, well, wasn't Neptune, Gabe, you cracking me up. So is claimed paradise. But, I think you might say like, well, wasn't Neptune discovered when it was in Pisces? Nope. Wasn't Pluto discovered when it was in Scorpio? Nope. In fact, when you look up the actual discovery charts for these outer planets, there's no clear indication that they rule what they rule. Aquarius for Uranus and Pisces for Neptune, or Pluto for Scorpio or Aries. So this is the reason why I don't use outers as rulers. But I want to be clear on something. I do use outers. I do Uranus related to her significations. I do Neptune related to his significations or her significations. I changed her sex a long time ago. And then I use Pluto related to the significations, although with closer refinement. I use Uranus, yes, related to, I think, spontaneous eruption of energy, right? More so, I make a parallel to Uranus as closely to the idea of what we talk about with the genius, or what we talk about with the daemon, that becomes our sense of individualized self or identity. So it's ways in which we honor our authenticity. Whereas Neptune, I kind of talk about as a light bulb, where you can have illumination, you can be blinded, or you can start to see things. So Neptune, those significations really work for me. And then for Pluto, I call Pluto the excavator, where we are probed to have or look for or need to experience depth, and more so making little things smaller and smaller things bigger. It's kind of like the principles of magnification. And John Michael Greer, in his book The Twilight of Pluto, makes a very interesting point, is that Pluto is almost like the antithesis of how we talk about the sense of harmony. It's where we're looking for, I wouldn't say chaos, but more so breaking a certain normative in order to go in a different fashion, different light, different way. So again, I use the significations, but I have been using those significations for about 20 years without modern rulership. You don't have to use the modern rulers. You don't. The traditional rulers work fine, and they work fine by virtue of the schema. It's kind of like saying, like, you need the umlaut in English. We really don't have that as part of our alphabet, right? So, or you must have, like, I don't know, some additional letters, the click sounds that we have from South Africa in the alphabet. We don't use that. We don't need that. So, Sensenya, I'm glad you're lighting. You're laughing. Yeah. So, yeah, you could use them as fixed stars as well, or the idea of them. And fixed stars have a very long tradition in astrology, in terms of Sirius and have mentioned as a fixed star. Also, in terms of, why am I blanking on my fixed stars right now? Aldebaran and Spica. And Spica is a very important planet as well. Well, I'm not planet, fixed star. I gotta eat. But one thing I want to say about this that I think is really important to really put into context. This is also the reason why I'm a tropical astrologer. You know, because I'm not going to get too deep in it now, but the significations, the assignment related to the planets with the signs does make sense when you're working related to the the tropical zodiac. But I have a question like, okay, then why are you using, if you're a siderealist, why are you using Venus as a ruler of Libra? If we're talking about precession of the equinoxes this way. But that's a different topic. One thing at a time. I don't know what's going on, Stephen Smith 818, but you're like writing, I don't know if you're writing me a message with L. Just want you to know, in case you know your button stuck. Anyway, does anyone have any questions before I go and I put this up on YouTube and leave this as a reel, blah, blah, blah? That's my explanation of why I don't use outers as rulers. Well, I'm going to assume that there are no questions. I thank you all for joining and yeah, Claimed Paradise and Taiga and Gimel Resh. Let me see, Kevin Willington, Scorpio 6 times astrology, a life balanced. It's almost your time, Libra. Sensenia, all the way in Deutschland. My German teacher Cam was here. I didn't know Cameron was here in June. It's been a long time, June. Marianne and Kat Bell, hello. Slobo, Catherine, Charmaine, hey, what's going on? Laura Hitt, let me see. Maybe I got some questions. Thank you. And thank you, Scorpio times, or Scorpio 6 times astrology. So yeah, you can follow it. Mary Nodes Day. That's wonderful. That's true. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for receiving it. And I will have this posted. Stephen, I really want to know why the L's. It's cracking me up. Like it's almost like you want to say, oh no, it's like then you have LI and like, do you think I'm lying? I'm not lying. All right. Anyway, thank you everyone. Bye bye.